The news that more than 50 people have died so far in Greek wildfires is just one part of a very much bigger story. There have been near record temperatures across the northern hemisphere. Japan calling it a natural disaster. Is this the new norm? Is global warming hotting up? You're watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Well, for years, scientists have been warning us about the effects of climate change. Deniers insisting it isn't man-made, it's just the normal cycle of the Earth. Well, whatever your view, you cannot deny that it is getting hotter.
For many of us, summer can't come soon enough. Long, hot days are something we look forward to every year. But as the Northern Hemisphere bakes under record-breaking temperatures and livelihoods are put at risk, should we be concerned that this is the new norm? Europe, North America and Asia are all in the grip of a severe heat wave. In Japan, monsoon rains caused by scorching hot temperatures have killed at least 200 people. This despite the country's extensive measures to prevent disaster.
The magnitude of the casualties of the destruction that we're seeing now really is an indication of just how big and how extreme this was and how heavy the rainfall was in such a short period of time.
In Pakistan, at least 65 people were killed as the mercury rose to nearly 45 degrees. In Canada, over 70 died in temperatures around the high 30s. Sweltering conditions in California have sparked wildfires, and even in the southern hemisphere, in the depths of winter, farmers in Australia are facing their worst drought in 100 years. 17 of the 18 hottest years on record have been since 2001. 2016 was the warmest. Last year was a close second. Is this a snapshot of what's to come? For decades, scientists have been warning us about the effects of climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions are said to be contributing to rising sea levels and severe weather events. The Paris Climate Change Agreement, which America pulled out of this year, aims to keep global warming below 2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution. But already it's almost 1 degree hotter today since records began in the late 1800s. And the UN now estimates temperatures could rise closer to 3 degrees by the year 2100. While some say emissions are to blame, others say natural fluctuations in the Earth's climate are also contributing. For millions of years, the world has dipped in and out of ice ages. The last one ended around 11,000 years ago. But the current rate of global warming has dramatically accelerated since the 1950s. Summer isn't over yet in the Northern Hemisphere, but so far it's on track to be one of the warmest. What does this mean for the future of the planet? We've heard the warnings, but are we prepared?
Well, here we sit in an air-conditioned studio for Roundtable. I trust it's the same in Geneva, from where we are joined by Clare Nullis from the World Meteorological Organization. You saw her in that report. Oxford, we have Friederike Otto, Deputy Director of the Environmental Change Institute, and with me in the studio, one of them is wearing shorts. I'll let you guess which one. Tom Burke, Chairman of the environmental think tank E3G, and Chris Brierley from the Department of Climate Science at University College London. Very warm welcome to each one of you. You're all experts, but try and bring this back to those of us who are just feeling a bit hot at the moment. Claire, what is going on? What are you going to do about it as well?
It's summer in the Northern Hemisphere. You in the UK are feeling the heat. That pattern's not uniform. Certainly, more southern parts of Europe have not had a blistering hot summer like they did last year. Having said that, yes, we are living in an era of climate change. We are seeing steadily increasing temperatures. We will not get a new heat record every year. We don't think so far 2018 is going to beat the record set in 2016. But yeah, the heat is certainly on. What can we do about it? Get on our bikes, cut out the polluting car journeys. There's a lot that we can do at individual level, and there's a lot that can be done and should be done at government level as well.
And guys at the studio, if we don't do what Claire's suggesting, what's going to happen?
It gets worse. It just goes on getting worse. It's like diabetes. It's a progressive disease. If you don't do something about it, it just goes on getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and if we adapt to the climate change, just the changes we're seeing, without taking some of the steps Claire's talking about to prevent the future ones at the same time, then we're just going to be constantly chasing to try and catch up.
And what that means, is essentially it's an existential threat to civilization. It means that all of the things we count on, being able to avoid conflict, to feed people, to provide enough water for people to drink, all of those things come under unbearable stress if we don't stop this problem from going on getting worse.
Friederike, have you got any idea at what point our very existence, this existential threat, is going to be so real for us?
Well, I don't want to speculate about that, but...
Go on.
Nope. And I think it also depends on what else happens. So climate change is real and it's happening, and it's certainly a big factor in the heat that we experience now. But it's always what happens when an extreme event happens. It's always a combination of different drivers. So in the heat we experience now, climate change is a big one, but whether or not that leads to losses, who gets affected, very much depends on what else happens in society and also what else happens in the natural systems. And so whether or not it will be an existential threat depends on what else we do with the world.
I mean, is this undoubtedly down to climate change, Freddie, or could it just be a hot summer?
Well, it is a hot summer, and natural variability plays a role. But the fact that we see so many of these hot summers and the intensity of the heat, that is increased because of anthropogenic climate change.
And Claire, you'd go along with that. It's undoubtedly because of the way we're treating our planet, is it? It's not because El Nino or El La Nina has come early or late or in the wrong time, whatever?
Certainly how we're treating our planet is playing a major role in this. And just to go back to your previous questions, what level, what stage do we reach this existential threat? I think it also very much depends on where we live in the world. Yeah. In Europe, there are very good protection mechanisms. There's very good disaster risk reduction. The Meteorological Service and the health authorities work very closely together. In many parts of the world, there isn't that safety net built in. We're making progress. So you're seeing in places like India, Pakistan now, they have got their act together when it comes to heat health warning systems, making more hospital beds available during heat waves. But in other parts, there is not that safety net. There is not the coping mechanism. What do you do with extreme heat, and particularly, the water stress, if you're in Northern Africa or if you're in some parts of Asia. So it really does depend on where we live in the world.
Okay, you wanted to jump in, I think.
Well, I was going to say, and also you need to think about how you're living with that water stress. I mean, with that heat. We're here in our air-conditioned studio, and that's keeping us cool, but clearly at the expense of putting heat elsewhere, in sucking the heat out of the studio and putting it out into the natural environment. And so it's
Is that going to make the outside hotter?
Yeah, of course. That's why.
Well, it's not an of course to me.
Oh, sorry. Yes, it is. You're taking the heat out and you're putting it outside into the city, and that's one of the reasons why cities in the summer are particularly...
But there are no gases involved in what I'm putting outside, no
not necessarily.
Greenhouse gases.
The electricity that you're using to power that might be from fossil fuels, or it might be from renewables.
Okay, but actually using an air conditioning unit makes
the
world a hotter place.
Yes.
Goodness
Yes.
gracious.
Yeah, and
Sorry if I'm sounding a
Oh,
bit
no,
thick,
no,
but I mean,
no,
these are
that's fine.
questions that don't...
to pick up Jeremy's point,
Yeah.
there are places in the world that, even if we didn't have climate change, are on the edge of being places where you can work, where human beings literally can live. Saudi Arabia is one of them. Saudi Arabia, we depend on our oil. If we go on pumping the temperature up, literally won't be possible for people to work outside in Saudi Arabia. Now, that's not an over there problem, because Saudi Arabia provides us with our oil. So you can't, even though Jim's absolutely right, where you are tells you how soon life becomes unsupportable. But actually, that has knock-on effects right away with us here in this part of the world.
Okay, and another question from the uninformed person in this chair is, look, we've had ice ages before, we hear about them. Have we had heat ages before?
There have been times a long way back where the world was much warmer than it is at the moment, but you're talking about times round about when the dinosaurs died out, 50 million years ago. And so they're not times that we as a species have experienced.
How did the planet survive that?
Certain species survived it.
No, I'm talking about, we're talking about destroying the nature of our planet with climate change at the moment. Not
Well, the planet will survive climate change, but humans not necessarily.
Yeah, that's really the point. The period in which we've had civilization is about the last 15,000 years or so, when we've had an extraordinary stable period of climate, when the natural variability has been actually very low. Now, you can get, on a geological timescale, much bigger variations in temperature. You just don't have people around in them.
Friederike, you laughed in a sort of derisory sort of way at my ignorance. I'm sure you didn't mean it unkindly. But as far as you're aware, was it as long ago as the age of the dinosaurs that we last experienced extreme temperatures?
Yeah, it was that was, I think, the last really warm period. And of course, on geological timescales, there have been warmer and cooler periods in line with the natural cycles of solar radiation and so on. But it's not these natural cycles that are changing the climate right now, and it's particularly the natural changes in the history of this planet have happened over thousands of years and not in one generation.
You see,
which is what we are experiencing now.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been reading about is we all know about the emissions that are man-made emissions. But what about the fact that the permafrost in Siberia is being affected by this? It is melting, and when it melts, it will release methane which is much more dangerous to the climate, as I understand it, than CO2 is. I'll come to you in a moment, Freddie, because I think you're saying, no, I'm wrong, which is quite natural to say I'm wrong. But let's get the studio.
Well, I was going to say, I think that process will happen, and it's uncertain as to quite whether it's going to come out as methane or carbon dioxide or what the threshold is. So there's uncertainties about it, but clearly it's warming up there. But it's not so much that that's much more of a feedback on the changes we've started to make, and then we're kicking in other processes. And it's not that that's a natural phenomenon. It's a response to what we've already initiated.
I'm going to try something a bit different here, okay? Because I've asked lots of questions so far, and some of them have been met with raised eyebrows or whatever. Why don't you just talk to each other as experts for 5 minutes, and I'll see if I can understand it. Go on, off you go with Claire.
Okay, I was going to pick up something that Chris pointed out, which rather struck you, which is that when you cool something, you pump warm air out, so you add to the warming. So if you do what human beings are going to do as they try to adapt, which is use a lot more air conditioning, you'll probably be using a lot of fossil fuels, which will make the problem worse, but also in your local environment, you'll be pumping lots more warm air out, creating heat islands in the places where people live. Now, climate change is full of these paradoxes, these kind of situations where whatever you do, you can make things worse. And the story that really catches me, you mentioned permafrost. The story that really caught me the other day. Oil companies rely on permafrost to provide solid foundations for their facilities in the Arctic. Because of climate change, the permafrost is starting to melt. So the oil companies are having to pump refrigerants into the permafrost in order to cool it so that their foundations remain stable. And as they do that, they're pumping warm air out into the atmosphere to make the temperature around them even warmer. Now, we're going to find thousands of those kind of contradictions emerging as we try to deal with a problem on this scale.
I can't keep quiet for too long. Sorry about this. I'm going to ask Claire a question. We heard there about heat islands. Now, I've also been reading that what is happening is we are getting pockets of air that are preventing weather fronts from moving in. They're just staying put. And as a result, it stays hot for a long time, or perhaps it'll stay cold for a long time. Is that a fair reading of it?
That's certainly what's happening at the moment. We have the jet stream, which is a very fast-moving band of air which regulates our weather and climate. I say it's fast moving. At the moment, it's not. It's sort of gone on a go slow. And so what we're seeing is a big high pressure system, which has been sitting over Northern Europe for quite some time. It's stationary. We call it a blocking pattern.
Which is the same as a bit like a heat island, as Tom mentioned.
And normally, these things would move along. So you might have a couple of days, of hot, sunny, dry weather. Then it would move on. Because it's blocked, it's sitting there. It does mean that this is why the UK, the Northern Europe, has seen these extraordinarily high temperatures for a long time now. I mean, even back in May, Scandinavia, was seeing very high temperatures back in May. And again, that was because of this same system, which basically hasn't really moved since then.
And Claire, isn't this partly caused because the temperatures are rising faster in the Arctic in the north? And so the temperature differential between the equator and the poles is reducing, and that has an impact on how the jet stream works?
Yeah, there's a lot of scientific research going on at the moment, and perhaps Freddie can also speak to that.
Well, she's frowning a bit at the moment. We'll go to her in a second, Claire.
Okay, there's a lot of scientific research that the melting of the Arctic ice is going to make the jet stream atmospheric circulation slow down, which means that when you do get these big kinks like that. You will have a stationary weather system for longer than perhaps in the past. We quite often see it in winter, but what we're seeing at the moment, obviously, is in summer.
There are two ways how climate change is affecting weather. One way is what we call the thermodynamic effect, and that is that when you increase greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you rise global mean temperature, and so you just have a warmer atmosphere. And that leads to a higher risk of heat waves. You have higher mean temperatures. You just basically push the distribution of normal temperatures towards higher temperatures. But there is also a second effect, and that is what we will call the dynamic effect. That when you change what the atmosphere is made of. So the gases in the atmosphere are greenhouse gases, and then you also have more water vapor, which is also a greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. When you change the composition of the atmosphere, that influences the atmospheric circulation. So where weather systems develop, how they develop, and where they move. And while we understand very well the thermodynamic component, and we definitely have a thermodynamic component in the heat that we experience right now. We don't at the moment have any kind of significant evidence that we see more blocking systems like the one we currently have. But in other parts of the world and for other extreme weather events, we do see that not only the thermodynamics change, so not only the global warming is affecting weather, but also that the dynamics change. So that you see, for example, when the rainfall that associated with hurricanes in the Atlantic, we see a higher increase in the rainfall than we would expect just from the warming alone. So there are also dynamic changes happening that's why global warming is not a very good indicator of how your weather is changing locally, because you have these two different effects, and the dynamic effect can act in both directions or not.
And Chris is nodding.
Yeah, and you've got
Phew.
Well, I was going to say,
He nods
What's-
when you give an answer. He frowns and so do
No,
you when I ask a question.
But I guess it's that difference between climate and weather as well. So we're talking about climate change, and climate is looking at the long term, and it's looking at the average of the sort of the noise that is the weather. And so I feel quite confident talking about future climate projections 80 years in the future, but I wouldn't be able to tell you precisely what the weather's going to be even sort of 3 months in the future.
Or next Wednesday sometimes.
But
As you know,
Freddie's producing a very important point about these dynamic changes. The weather in Western Europe is very heavily shaped by the existence of the Gulf Stream, which transfers energy to Western Europe, which keeps it warmer than it would otherwise be. But as you melt the ice in the Arctic, so you get input some fresh water to that part of the Atlantic, which drives the Gulf Stream forward. And we're beginning to be questions now raised about whether we'll slow down the Gulf Stream. If that happens, then we'll find that our temperature will be much more like the temperature in Canada at this latitude, which is a lot colder. So these are...
Until the Earth shifts on its axis, which is due to do any time now.
Well, you might want to hope
You
it
find that
shifts in the right
Helsinki ends
way.
up in Djibouti.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really important to disentangle what we can observe and what we know that is happening already, and what are theories that are plausible. And I think this, it's plausible that the thermohaline circulation will change because of increase in global mean temperatures and more fresh water in that, but it's not something that we could project will happen anytime soon, or where we have any evidence that this is really going to happen. And the same is with the Arctic, with the input of the of the melting of the Arctic sea ice on the large-scale circulation. It's pretty certain that it does have an effect on the Arctic circulation. And there are things that, and there are theories that are very plausible and that we see in climate models, but not everything that is possible, and it certainly is a risk, is also something that's happening already. So I think there are two very different kinds of scientific research going on, and that can explain what we see.
You know, the world
today.
is changing so rapidly at the moment. We're seeing new advances in technology almost every 5 minutes. How about this for a crazy idea? That in the not too distant future, it's possible to put something into space which is sucking up all the greenhouse gases and kicking them off into the ether.
People are suggesting not quite like that, but you take it out of the atmosphere and put it into the sort of the rocks and keep it out of the way.
There are lots of possibilities
Yeah.
that engineers and scientists are beginning to discuss. I just have a very simple question. If you can't get people to agree to do something we know how to do, which is stop putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, why do you think you're going to get them to agree to do something we don't know how to do?
Well, perhaps because it could become a weapon, if you like. If you control the ability to take the greenhouse gases away from the planet, then you are effectively one of the most powerful people that there is, and it could become a weapon of war.
And so that does raise questions of equity in this thing. And one of the big problems we're facing here is what we're doing now is determining what's happening 2 generations down the line.
Something that David
We've got to
said,
give Clare a chance in
I
just a
know,
moment.
something David said, look, if we're going to deal with this problem, we have to cooperate with each other if we're going to deal with it. The idea that some nation or some individual or some company can take advantage of this and hold the rest of us to ransom doesn't understand the problem. If we're going to deal with a problem on this scale, geological scale problem, we're going to have to cooperate. We don't have a technological or an economic barrier to solving the problem of climate change. All the barriers are political barriers.
Claire, just a quick one to end with. I mean, whenever most of us go out on a nice sunny day, we think this is fantastic, let's enjoy it. We don't think about the end of the world. But I mean, in your job, presumably you do every time the sun comes out.
No, I don't think at the end of the world every time the sun comes out. I enjoy it. I listen to the advice. I put on sunscreen. Follow the UV warnings. It's not the end of the world. We shouldn't be over pessimistic. But we do need to be reasonable. You know, we've got to cut our carbon imprint, carbon footprint. We have an international agreement. It's called the Paris Agreement. We need to implement that and to make it work.
Well, unfortunately, we know what one of the biggest polluters on Earth has decided to do with the Paris Agreement, the United States.
But that's the president and not the rest of the populace. And California's making great strides.
And also, 3 days before he did that, the BlackRock, Vanguard and State Street, three of the biggest asset managers in the world, voted against the board of Exxon because it wasn't doing enough to deal with its climate risks. So I think it matters that the President of the United States has said what he said, but there are a lot of other people who don't agree with him who are actually doing things.
We are not going to change anything on this programme, but thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Freddie.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the programme. Enjoy the summer, if you can. And thank you very much indeed for watching. It's been Roundtable. It's back to work in the hot office downstairs, away from this air-conditioned studio in just a moment. And in case you were wondering who was wearing the shorts in the studio, it's this one. Bye-bye.